Hello there. So today we'll be focusing on a flaw question, more specifically the one dealing with sufficient and necessary. So if you read this on the screen, takes a condition that is sufficient for a particular outcome as one that is necessary for the outcome. And if you're not sure what that means, then no worries, because we're going to explain exactly what that means. And on the other hand, if you do have an understanding of what that means, this video can also be helpful because we'll go over some tips and strategies. So to understand this flaw, we have to look into conditionals. And a conditional is basically an if-then. So for example, it might be something like, if it rains, then I'll bring an umbrella. And it should be noted that the first half of the conditional, the left-hand side, is always the sufficient, and the right-hand side is always the necessary. So let's look at an example to explain this further. So here it is. If you live in Florida, then you live in the USA. And once again, the left-hand side is sufficient. So Florida is sufficient, and sufficient means it's something that brings about result. So if you live in Florida, then you live in the USA, but there's other conditions that also make you live in the USA. So some other sufficient conditions would be Ohio, California, Texas, Alaska, New Jersey, and so forth. On the other hand, the second half, USA, is necessary, because if you think about it, if you live in Florida, necessarily you have to live in the USA. You don't live in Italy, you don't live in Germany, you don't live in Japan, you live in the United States of America. And with that said, now finally we can look at the flaw. So we have our initial example. If you're in Florida, then you're in the USA. But then they flip it. If you're in the USA, then you're in Florida. Which is obviously wrong, because if you're in the USA, there's multiple other locations that you can be in, such as California. And if you think about it, they're confusing the sufficient and necessary condition. So if you remember, the first half is always sufficient and the second half is always necessary. So Florida in the first example is sufficient, and in the bottom, they're necessary. So it's treating Florida as sufficient and necessary at the same time. And you ever see this implication? Then it's the fallacy, confusing the sufficient and necessary condition. It should be noted there's a couple different configurations of this example. So looking at the screen, on the left-hand side, example 1 is what we did. And example 2 on the right-hand side is something a bit different, but logically means the same thing. So in example 2, so the start is the same, if in Florida, then in the USA. But then it diverges, is a bit different. Not in F, then not in the USA. And we could do a trick to convert this. So it's something called a contrapositive, which you might have heard of. But if you have not, then basically it's a technique to rewrite a conditional in a different format. So the trick is you flip it and negate it. So first we could flip it. So USA goes in first, F goes on the second half. And since it's already negated, you negate the not, it's a double negative, and it becomes positive. And basically it means the same thing as USA, then Florida. And then you can see it's exactly the same thing as example 1. The same fallacy, the same idea. So that's one way of understanding it, looking at the logic. But there is another way, understanding it intuitively. So if you look at the middle, not in Florida, then not in the USA, it should be clear it just does not make sense. Because if you're not in Florida, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not in the USA. Because you could be in Wyoming, California, Washington, Oregon, and so forth. And once again, they're basically implying that Florida is necessary. In order to be in the USA, necessarily you have to be in Florida, which is a fallacy in this case. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. So now we'll look at some problems. And as you can see, there's a problem on the screen. So you could pause the video, try solve it on your own, and then we'll go over it together. So the correct answer is A. So if you picked that, good job. If not, then no worries, we'll explain it. So let's go over it a little bit and explain exactly why A is correct. So we're dealing with a flawed question, and also we're dealing with an argument. So the first thing we need to do is find the conclusion, and in this case, the conclusion is at the very end. Therefore, Village Plus Furniture must have at least 100 employees. And you have to ask yourself, okay, how do we know this? Why do they must have at least 100 employees? And you note that they also mention 100 employees towards the middle, and there's a conditional right in the middle. And that conditional states any local business that has at least 100 employees will receive funds from the grant. And we know Village Plus Furniture received that grant, and therefore, basically, they're saying that they have 100 employees. So basically, they're using some kind of like conditional logic that's improper, confusing the sufficient and necessary condition, which you could see in the diagram below. So you don't need to write out the diagram. I'm just using it to basically explain it more clearly. But inside your mind, this is the way you want to think about it. So that explains why A is correct, but we could briefly look at the other ones. So looking at B, basically this is the whole versus part flaw, which is not applicable in this case. C has to do with contradiction. They never contradict themselves. D is a causal versus correlation, which they never made that. And E is presupposes a truth, which is a form of circular reasoning. They're assuming the truth without ever proving it. And if any of those are confusing from B, C, D, or E, in future videos we'll explain more thoroughly the different types of flaws and what exactly they mean. But for this video, we just want to focus on the sufficient and necessary flaw. And now we have our next question. So once again, you could pause the video, and once you're ready, you could unpause it, and we'll go over it. For this one, the correct answer is D, which is worded a little bit differently than the previous one, but fundamentally, it's the same idea, confusing the sufficient and necessary condition. So let's explain it so it's more clear. So once again, we want to understand the argument, and the first place to start with that is finding the conclusion. And the conclusion in this case is the last sentence. Therefore, the recent allegations of misconduct within our academic unit lack any foundation. And okay, why? How do we know this? Well, one place to start with is the first sentence, which is a conditional. And in simple terms, they're saying if there's a monetary contribution that exceeds 1,000, then that is a violation. Later on, the dean mentioned that he knows for a fact that no department faculty ever took such an offering. And from this, he concludes there was no violation. And I mapped out the logic on the bottom left. And if you see, looking at the middle part, if you take the contrapositive, so once again, flip and negate it, it goes from violation to 1,000. And you can see they're treating the 1,000 as a sufficient condition and later on as a necessary condition. But with that said, D is saying something slightly different. But even though it's different from that, it's the same idea. And the reason why is because they think the 1,000 is a necessary condition for violations. They fail to consider that there might be other things that could potentially cause a violation. And that's it. We're done. So if you have any questions, just let us know, but I hope it was helpful.